welcome to this episode of the Carlyle podcast. For the listeners that know, my initial objective for launching this podcast was to get those in and around the sports industry in whatever capacity as guests to sort of shed light on their roles within the industry. And it's an absolute pleasure to have film director and owner of Scampy Jones Media, Rob Sloman, with me now. He's directed and produced many different sports documentaries over the years, including those on rugby and golf, and most recently come to light with the fantastic football documentary Everton Howard's Way, which came out last year. So, Rob, how are you doing, pal?
No, I'm all right. I'm all right, Max. How are you?
Very good. As I say, it's great to have you on, and it's great to actually finally have this chance to sit down and talk with you. I mean, it'd be much preferred to do it over a cup of tea, but in the current situation, just got to do what you got to do.
We're all getting used to these, aren't we now?
Yeah, it's sort of the way of the world. I was going to say, I first saw you at the premiere for Howard's Way, which was in two locations, firstly at Goodison and then at St George's Hall, and unfortunately didn't get the chance to speak to you at the sort of media part because it was really busy. It was split between two different locations and everything was a bit chaotic. I didn't actually get the chance to speak to you until I believe it was the 2-0 home defeat against bottom of the league Norwich, which I thought was...
Yeah, I remember it well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you've made this fantastic documentary on us in our finest hour, and typical of these times that we spoke after that. And it wasn't until then, really, that I realised just how much that you'd done, because, we sort of spoke in depth, and you said that you worked at Sky Sports and you'd studied journalism. You'd work within, say, newspapers and then switch to TV, which is something that I'd like to ask you about later. Firstly, especially for people around my age, people like myself who are soon to graduate and want to find work in the industry, would you mind giving a sort of walkthrough of your career and how you've got to this point today?
Crikey. That was a long time ago. At school, I always wanted to be involved with sport in any way, really. I realised very early on, I remember when I was about 6 or 7, people said, "Oh, are you going to be a footballer?" I was, "Yeah, I'm going to be a footballer." And I was very one-footed. I was quite quick, but I had nothing else. So really and truthfully, probably rugby was my best game, but I wasn't brave enough. So as I went through school, I realised I wasn't going to play anything. Then I just started to look at what I could do that would keep me involved with sport. And I was down in Cornwall, a place called Bude. I do remember a couple of teachers taking an interest in the fact that I thought maybe I could write about sport when I left school. And so helped me dig out some potential routes, some courses. And we established that do the A-levels, and I could then do a 1-year journalism course, NCTJ journalism course. I think there were about 4 or 5 different colleges that you could do those courses, where you could do those courses, and Cardiff was the one that I elected to try and go there. So that would have been 1987. Got scraped through my A-levels with good enough results to go there, and I did scrape them. And I went there and did this 1-year course, and it was a really enjoyable time. I never really wanted to get 3 or 4 years of additional education. That didn't really suit me. I wanted to try and do stuff. I'd done a little bit of work experience, which is what they recommended when you got onto the course. Go and do some work experience if you can before you start. So I'd done work experience with a local newspaper, just get an idea of what people did. I don't think that anybody who's worked in local newspapers will tell you that you can really know what you're in for until you're part of a local newspaper. But anyway, went and did a year's course there, got the relevant qualifications, so you pass the course. I can't remember what it's called, a proficiency certificate, a bit like riding a bike. So passed that. Lots of things like shorthand, which I still use now. I still leave notes for people in shorthand, forget all about it, and of course they pick them up and they're like, what on earth does he want? So so learned that there. And I was lucky because I came out of college in 88, and if I'd have taken the route that a lot of my friends did and did a 3-year journalism course, they came out 1990. There were very few jobs, and when I came out in '88, I was able to cherry pick to a certain degree, and never considered that I wouldn't move away from Cornwall. Fabulous place, but probably better to now, for me certainly as an adult, to go down there on holiday with the kids, etc., rather than be there, I felt. So I got offered a couple of different positions. Took one on a paper called the Surrey Herald in 1988, and joined there as a editorial assistant, or I can't remember joined there in '88, and went from there. Really, lots of cups of teas made for the first 6 months, I remember. And initially, I was a bit concerned how I was going to get into sports. There was a sports desk, but there were 2 people on it, and I wondered how that would work. But actually, it was very good to do the news training. All of the early things that I did would follow a news reporter around, go to stories breaking, and then you try and get a byline in the newspapers, and then you want to get the front page byline, and so on. And eventually people move around or take a different job, either at that newspaper or move to a different newspaper or radio or TV or whatever. And a job came up on the sports desk. And then I worried that I wouldn't be able to get into local sport, that I was too much international and national sport, and that it wouldn't interest me, and I couldn't have been more wrong. From the moment I got on the sports desk at the Surrey Herald, which was about April, May of 1990, I absolutely loved it. The non-league football that we used to do, I think back then it was called the Diodora League, the conference and then the Diodora, and I had a blast of a time. I worked covering teams like Staines Town and Chertsey and Egham Town. I'll never forget Egham Town. They went on whilst I was there, they went on a run to the 4th qualifying round of the FA Cup, which is a really big deal for a team that small. And they got beaten by Telford 2-0. Around about that stage, Telford were not a bad non-league team. And obviously Everton had played them in the Cup a few years before that. But it was really good fun. Lots of characters on local newspapers. I would recommend that route to anybody. And I know newspapers aren't now what they were then, but in terms of a learning experience, it was fantastic. And I went from the Surrey Herald, which gave me the opportunity to also. I love golf. I've always loved golf, and where I was in Surrey was a big golf area, and Wentworth was just up the road. It fell within our map, if you like, of Surrey, so we were able to go there and cover the World Match Play and the PGA that were always at Wentworth. The PGA in May, and the Match Play then was in October, I think. And got to see Seve was my hero. I hadn't worked with him at that point. Went on to work with him later, but I remember going to the Match Play in the PGA at Wentworth with an armband as member of the media, and just followed him around. Didn't write many stories. I just followed Seve. So. But it was a great experience. Went from that paper to another one based in Slough, and again that was fantastic as well. Was on that one for a couple of years as a sports editor, and we had the first year I was there, Slough Town were challenging Wycombe, who were under Martin O'Neill. So Martin O'Neill's Wycombe and Dave Kemp's Slough Town were vying for promotion from the conference to the Football League. And Wycombe were a lot better than anybody else. But I do remember even that had some exciting times. And the second year I was there, Slough Town were fighting relegation from the conference, and they didn't survive. And actually, the last day they had to go to Halifax and win to have any chance of staying up. And it was the same day that Everton were playing Wimbledon, having to win to have any chance. And I was acting so I'd gone up to Halifax, and I was acting as reporter and photographer. They didn't want to send 2 of us up there, so I had to give me a camera and said, whatever happens, take some pictures. So at the end, I went onto the pitch, and obviously I'm listening. I've got one earpiece in, just listening on the Walkman or whatever. And it's 2-2 when I go on the pitch, because the Premier League's got a few minutes left, about 10 minutes left. Slough have just been relegated. They've lost 1-0. So all the Slough players that I've got to know over the last couple of years and know one or two of them quite well, they're all in bits on the floor. And I'm there just about to start taking pictures when Graham Stewart's goal goes in. And with all due respect to Slough Town, they never really meant as much to me as Everton. So I'm now wanting to explode with joy, but at the same time, try and take pictures of the Slough Town players who are desolate. They're on the floor, and I'm clearly not as desolate as they are, when I probably should be as the local reporter. So that was an interesting few minutes while they were trying to work out why, I didn't seem overly disappointed. And obviously all I want to do really is get half a dozen shots taken, go and yell, and then possibly, I think Les Briley was the manager of Slough when they went down, I think he was. And I'll just go and do the interviews, etc., and then go and see my mates who I'd driven up with, who were Slough Town fans, but all had a league club as their favourite, who would have been, excited for me, I think, and drive all the way back down from Halifax, celebrating on the way that we were still a Premier League club.
Yeah.
So that was newspapers, and then the following, when was that? So that was 93-4, wasn't it? A couple of months later, I leapt to go to. I was doing some national newspaper sub-editing anyway, and I leapt because Sky were going from 1 channel to 3, and so I wanted to see what that was like. So I went across to Sky at that point.
Okay, this is something that I really wanted to ask you about, because similarly to yourself, I was often told that I did media at A levels and what have you, and I was always told I had a specific talent for writing. But now, as you were saying, newspapers then to what newspapers are now are a very different animal. And I, hopefully a couple of years down the line, I really do want to make my own media company. But I'd imagine now, given the current climate, that the focus will be on video and audio. So I just wanted to ask, what deferred you from writing to go into television?
I'm trying to think back. I just think that I still love writing. I still, I think everybody feels they've got a book in them, don't they? And I think that maybe actually a book around the film that we've just made, The Howard's Way, might work, because obviously I've got hours and hours of stuff from the players, but there are so many stories that came up that we weren't able to put in an hour and 50 minutes. Lots of other things that came up, and many of which are fan related, very funny stories, unbelievable stories to a kid like me from Cornwall, who sort of lived a fairly sort of narrow and straight lifestyle down there and didn't break rules. Breaking rules is a big thing at the moment, isn't it? Well, I didn't break very many. But I still feel like I want to write, and I'm quite happy to write. But Sky and TV, I think probably because I was reporting at that time, I fancied the idea of reporting on TV. But I remember one of the very first interviews that I had at Sky, a chap turned around to me and said, there is power and glory in any form of work, and with TV, glory is potentially the people that are in front of camera, and glory is only ever temporary. And he said, aim for power, aim for power, be making stuff, be making decisions, and give yourself an opportunity of potentially a longer career, maybe. And I also remember seeing, I think Jeff Stelling was one of the first shows I worked on. Jeff Stelling was the presenter, and I watched him, and I thought, if you don't think you can ever be as good as that, then why would you bother? Because if you can't be really good at something, why would you do it? And I watched him, and I knew straight away, you might have a good day where you think, yeah, everything's flowing, and I can certainly talk. But I thought, listening to him and the information he was being given, and how none of the panic behind the scenes was translating to what you would see with Jeff, I thought that was a skill. A great skill, and I still watch him and know what's going on, and think that he's somebody. He came out of radio, I think, and probably started in newspapers. I don't know about Jeff, but probably went newspapers, radio, TV, and you get a great editorial background coming through newspapers. And I remember watching him and thinking, nah, the guy I'd spoken to at Sky was right. Let's focus on, because you can still write when you're behind the scenes, you're writing scripts. Very different to write scripts for TV than it is to write a story for a newspaper. But you learn all these things, you pick up the skills, and quickly agreed with him that listen, this might be the thing to do. And also, I think that the first couple of years at Sky. So the first couple of years at Sky, when I thought, well, maybe I could do some reporting as well, I was coinciding with losing hair and losing confidence. So maybe thinking, maybe behind the camera and making some decisions rather than being up there and worrying about how my hair looks would be the better way to go. So Sky. It felt like Sky was going to become something, and obviously it did. And they were covering so much sport, and it was all the sports that I was interested in, and obviously the Premier League was exploding, etc. It just felt like it was going to be an exciting place to be, and it was. So yeah, I could easily have stayed in newspapers. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it was good fun, writing stuff, going. I never really got to experience the going to a football match late on a Tuesday or a Wednesday night and the deadline, phoning in copy, and these guys that could do that. Never really did that, but always felt I could write. But at that particular time, the mid-90s, it felt that it was an exciting company to join. Sky, very, very much smaller than it is now. The whole of Sky Sports then was pretty much in one office, one fairly big office, but one office. And now, I haven't been to Sky for a year or two, but the last time I went there, it was a complete maze. I mean, buildings everywhere, and it looks, it's an extraordinary place. And I've worked at all of the, I worked at ITV and BBC and Sky and other places, and never been blown away as I was when I last went to Sky and saw what a development it now is. But yeah, it felt exciting to make that switch, and that was probably the biggest driver behind it, and opportunities, big events, really big events that they were working on, that to have a crack at it and see what would happen.
Most definitely, and very wise words. Aim for power, not glory. I'll be sure to take stock of them. Now, Scampy Jones Media, I believe 2008. What were the steps that you took to get your own media company up and running? I feel it's a very smart move.
Yeah, okay. It might seem like a smart move now. At the time, it seemed like one of very few options. I'd been working for a company. So I went from, let me try and, if I work it out as I talk, then it'll make more sense to me. So I went from Sky to the BBC. Quite a difficult jump, going from what that organisation to the BBC, or the other way around, I would imagine, because Sky sort of pretty much threw you in at the deep end and said learn. And the BBC, I went there thinking, okay, I've been at Sky 4 or 5 years, done quite a lot of stuff there, and I felt I was capable of doing quite a bit. And I went to the BBC and felt it was, by Sky standards, quite restrictive, quite done by the book. It was just very different. So from having been able to get tapes out, go and sort yourself out at Sky, at BBC, sign this, do this, go and see this person, it was very different. So I'm not saying one is right and the other one's wrong, but it was very different. So actually I wasn't at the Beeb very long before there was a company starting up called British Eurosport. So Eurosport was very well established, but British Eurosport was starting up. And they had great secondary rights, you name the event, and they weren't the main rights holder, but they had secondary rights. So they weren't exclusive, but they were piggybacking. So the Olympics and the World Cup and the Rugby World Cup, which we worked on, and European football, which I remember working on in 2000. First place I met Trevor Stephen was the Euros, 2000 Euros, which we had loads of technical problems because some of us were back at base camp putting the programs together, and other elements of the production were on site. And we had, I think, the first game, Belgium were at home in the first game, I think. And, or Belgium were playing in the first game. And we had a 5-second delay between pictures and audio. And so we just couldn't, the technical guys couldn't straighten it. We couldn't sort it out. So the commentator is so far ahead of the pictures that we're seeing. And amongst some of the helpful suggestions we're getting is, can you not tell him to sort of delay his commentary, i.e. remember what he saw 2 seconds ago? So just some unbelievable stuff. So I remember Mpenza scored the first goal, and he shouts for Mpenza, and Mpenza is hasn't got the ball in what the pictures that we're putting out. So we had loads of problems there, but British Eurosport was great fun because all of the problems that it threw at us were things that you could never imagine coming. We'd gone virtual before anyone else had gone virtual. So no cameraman, just there was a studio director, the producer, me, who was also doing auto cue and graphics a lot of the time. So you're doing auto cue graphics. You're also operating the server to give clips, when you're doing analysis, that's coming from you as well. So there's 3 or 4 of you in this room instead of 10 or 12. And it was utter chaos at times, utter chaos. But, you'd get home and you'd be exhausted, but you think, oh, it's brilliant fun. That's brilliant fun. So that was much as, it felt in many ways to go Sky, BBC, British Eurosport maybe wasn't, in terms of ego, wasn't a great move. It was a brilliant move. So I spent a couple of years there. And then did the Lions, the British and Irish Lions, behind the scenes in 2001. British Eurosport were part owned by NTL. NTL was sponsoring the Lions, so I pushed myself forward very hard to do that. Loved rugby, still do, and got that gig. And that was the first documentary I'd ever been involved in and was in charge of it, which was quite frightening. And that experience there basically was the template for everything else, because what I went through out there, and it was quite hard. The 6 or 7 weeks thrown in with these world-class athletes who don't know who the hell you are and don't have much time for you. Certainly don't have any respect for you to start with. That was eventful. So we did 6 weeks, 7 weeks with them, and then you come back and you edit it for about 8 weeks it was. But that experience, I knew at that time, that moment there, okay, that's what I want to do. I don't know if I can do it, because it's one thing to say, yeah, I want to go and cover major events and make documentaries. It's another thing to be able to find people who will back you or help you. Mm-hmm. But I knew from that moment that's what I wanted to do if I could. So I went from Eurosport. Funnily enough, I went to ITV and ITV Sport Channel, the 20 or I can't remember what it was called, but the sports channel, ITV Sport, maybe it was called Sports Channel, fell over within 6 months of being there. And I was lucky because the people that had been involved with the DVD and the video of the Lions tour owned a company that they were looking to make a lot bigger. They wanted a TV arm, they wanted a sports production arm. So that was a really big break. And I went to them, and so I wasn't out of work for any point. And lots of people went to the ITV channel, sport channel, and trusted that would go on for a few years, and of course it didn't. Mm-hmm. But I was lucky, and I got this company called Lace. And if you've got DVDs like England 5, Germany 1, that you'll look at the publisher for those, and it's Lace. So we went down there, and I started working for Lace in 2002. And timing was good. They had the rights for the Rugby World Cup for the following year. And England won the World Cup, and I went out there and was able to make a film about that tournament. And again, it was sort of interview. It's quite similar to Howard's Way, really, in that went and spoke to a lot of the players afterwards and put the film together retrospectively. But was there from 2002 until 2008, when the company, 2008, if you remember, the early part of that year financially was a disaster for everyone. And they were about to expand. And in fact, when they went to expand, the banks told them, no, actually, you're going to have to cut back. So Lace TV was a victim of that. And so had a couple of weeks where I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and took loads of advice. And then, okay, with the contacts that I've got and the people I've worked with, maybe this is worth having a crack at. But didn't really know whether it was going to work out or not, Max, to be honest. If you told me, what are we now, 2020, so 12 years on, that it would have gone as well. Certainly it didn't feel like it was going to go that way. I think early part of 2009, and you're just thinking, I don't know what to do here. But stuck with it, kept, just when you think this might be a problem, another contract would come in, somebody else, another phone call, whatever, and just managed to just about keep it going. So it was certainly more luck than judgment. I didn't intend, I wasn't, in March '08, I wasn't thinking, oh, I must set up a production company of my own. And in May '08, I had one. So that's how it worked.
Brilliant, and I'm very glad that it's been successful. You know, for the likes of Howard's Way, it's most definitely for me now. It's good. Never mind sports film, but it's up there with my favourite films. Just full stop. Like, it's one of those films that I can watch continually. Like, I've watched it multiple times already.
Do you know, as soon as I got, even before, when I was at the previous company, Lace, I was writing treatments for an Everton film, because I just thought, well, nothing's been done, and you know, if someone will show enough interest, and I'm working for a company that's got roots to the, you know, the big film houses, the Universals, etc. of this world, but no one at that point really believed in it, and so you just sort of tuck it away, and you think, well, maybe I'll be able to bring out that treatment. I think around about that time, around about maybe 2007, was the first time I'd written something called Everton, the Team That Time Forgot. But yeah, it took a lot longer to get it going. But you know, I was lucky with Lace that that's how the Sevi thing happened. Just an email from his company at that time, before he was poorly, found its way to me, and you know, you end up then spending a year at that point. So that would have been 2006, and the following year we make a documentary with Sevi, who was, you know, Bob Latchford, Viv Richards, and Sevi Ballesteros were my three heroes. They were my three heroes all that time as a kid growing up, and I had plenty of others that weren't quite on that level. You know, I was a big Kirk Stevens fan. Won't mean anything to you, but Kirk Stevens, Jimmy Connors. I love Jimmy Connors, and you name a sport, and I had somebody that I liked. But those three stood alone: Latchford and Viv Richards and Sevi. So got unbelievably spent a year working with Sevi. You know, went to Augusta with him, and we took a helicopter before people used drones. We took a helicopter over St Andrews and filmed with Sevi. I mean, mind-blowing stuff, really. I think about it now, and the good fortune for those things to end up with me. And then, you know, when it was Scampy Jones, yeah, the bigger film ideas that you had were more difficult to push through, because who are you? You know, you might have worked at Sky and Beeb a few years back, but doesn't really mean much now. So you've got to make a film to be able to make films almost. And, you know, it was a long time making good contacts that eventually you stumble on one. And Everton, I was lucky, I went to Universal about something completely different. And the guy there at the time was, you know, he'd been behind I Believe in Miracles from Universal's point of view. So, you know, he was looking for another I Believe in Miracles. And he said to me, you know, I think a film about your mob in the 80s would work. It has so many similar aspects to it. And I was like, well, so happens that I have something. So he said, well, go away and flesh it out and send it to me, and get yourself a budget, and we'll have a look at it. And I did those things, and he loved it, and then left Universal. So it felt like starting again, and that's why in the end we didn't go with Universal, because their appetite for the particular film went with Richard, I felt. And then it was all about trying to, you know, a story I've told a few times about trying to get private investment, and you know, that's not easy. So you know, but it all started with a trip to Universal and a chap called Richard Thompson.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned I Believe in Miracles to me when we met after that Norwich game, and cited it as a big.
Yeah, I said go and watch it, didn't I?
Yeah, I watched it recently. Maybe my personal bias, but I do much prefer Howard's Way. For those that don't know it, I Believe in Miracles stories Brian Clough joining Nottingham Forest, leading them to promotion and 2 European Cups. Very much a story that deserves to be told. But as an Everton fan, what I've always loved, and I suppose as a media student as well, I've loved the fact that there's always been a relationship there with the club and the media almost. You know, you've had in the 60s, you had the Golden Vision, which tells the story of the team in the 60s and that FA Cup triumph. And then you've got the likes of the Here We Go records from the 80s themselves. What I wanted to ask is what I think stands Howard's Way out so much more in comparison is the way you include the context of the 60s and the 70s, from when Howard arrives to getting the perspective of so many different people, who are like players, fans, Derek Hatton's in there, Keith Mullen from the farm, and you get media personnel and their opinions like Clive Tilsley and Jim Rosenthal. What was the intention in mind when you started off on the process of making Howard's Way?
What was the intention? It was to give the side some credit, I think. Yeah, we're all biased as Evertonians, but that team has just never received the credit that it deserved, and we will never be able to prove that it would have gone on to create its own dynasty. You can't prove it. I think it would have, in an era when I think English clubs had won 7 of the previous 8 European Cups, not counting '85. So if you don't count the night of Heysel, Liverpool win that game if there's no trouble. I'm sure they were the best side in Europe other than us, and English sides dominated Europe. And I think Everton were as good a side as England had had going into Europe for a long time. You know, it's difficult to say anything against the Liverpool team or Forest, but the Forest game against Hamburg. I remember Hamburg. I could be wrong, but I remember Hamburg battering Forest, and certainly when Villa won, they beat Bayern Munich, didn't they? Bayern Munich, it was all Bayern Munich, and Villa scored the goal and hung on to it. So great, they were resolute, but Everton were a lot more than that. Everton were a lot more than the Villa team, and it's difficult to compare eras, isn't it? But to suddenly go past a Liverpool team by so many points, beat them 3 years that season, didn't concede a goal. Everton were better than Liverpool. And the injury the one thing that I think that I always, it would have been nice to be able to tell it in the film, but obviously it happened afterwards. Bracewell's injury against Newcastle in '86. Okay, so he plays a lot of games after that. But I'm sure if you ever do anything with Paul Bracewell, he knows, and everybody knows, he was never the same after that. And if you look at the missing ingredient, which made Everton, a really good side at the end of '83-4, winning the FA Cup, but then made them by far the best team, 84-5. Well, what is there? There's 2 players. There's Bracewell and there's Van den Hauwe. And Pat obviously made a difference. But that midfield was entirely dominant over every team that they played that season, other than when they were knackered. Reid and Bracewell and Stephen and Sheedy, a lot of people online putting their best teams of Everton through the eras together at the moment, isn't there? Pick your team from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And obviously I never saw the Holy Trinity. So, I can't, if you're picking teams that you watched, but I cannot put Kanchelskis above Trevor Steven. I can't put anybody above Bracewell or Reid, and certainly not Sheedy. So, it was a magnificent team and a magnificent midfield with the best goalie in the world, the fastest back 4 that you can ever imagine. They were all sprinters. They were all real athletes. And then up front, tell me who'd want to play against Sharp and Gray. Or, you ask the players, you ask Kev Sheedy and Trevor Steven how good Adrian Heath was. They talk about him being their favourite striker of all. So, listen, that was an incredible team. And but for Brace's injury and then '87, them all wanting to disappear and play European football or manage European teams, I can't see any reason why we wouldn't have been winning a lot more towards the end of that decade and the start of the next. And then Sky arrives in '92. I just won't have it that if none of those things, if we're still playing European football in '87 when Everton would go in as champions of England, if we're still playing European football, I just don't have it. A young team, 24 average in '86, Everton are still not a giant club when Sky arrives with the money in '92. I think that Heysel had a terrible, terrible damning effect. Obviously, listen, other clubs have recovered from not being in Europe at that time, done better. I'm not saying that we did everything right. Obviously, there were things that we did very wrong in that period of time, but the decline started in Heysel, and we've never recovered from it, in my opinion.
Most definitely, and that's the point that I try to make, especially towards Liverpoolians who seem to be quite stubborn to the idea that, as you say, yes, we didn't do everything right, but if we are in those positions of winning league titles and winning European honours when the Premier League monies kicks in around '92, I've got no doubt that we'd be sort of asserting our dominance and still competing quite heavily for those, those European places now.
I agree with you. It's all about timing, isn't it? It's all about timing. I've said it a million times, but if Heysel happens in the mid-70s, then Liverpool don't get their chance to create that dynasty. There is no Liverpool dynasty. Those players don't become the extraordinarily famous names that they are now. I was watching Harry's Heroes last week, and Trevor Steven was in an episode. One of the best players ever to play for Everton, but potentially got a lower profile than a lot of the others in that film, who achieved nothing like he did in the game. Nothing like it. He more England caps, 2 league titles, European title, FA Cup. So all of those achievements, but you would have done well to spot him in Harry's Heroes. Now, if Everton had the opportunity to go on and play in European Cups and win European Cups, are you telling me that Trevor Stevens' profile would be so low that he doesn't merit a mention in Harry's Heroes with those other guys? And I know that there might be stronger stories there because somebody's so overweight, or the gambling and the debt. Those are all good stories, and I get it editorially. But there are other players on that pitch that didn't achieve what he did, that were featured in a more positive fashion. And he was in one of those. Actually, one of the reasons why he didn't get more of a part, I believe, is because he honoured a Howard's Way engagement for me. But it's ridiculous that team that those quality of players at that age, Bracewell,
so young. It's ridiculous how young that team was.
It was only Reedy and Andy Gray that were, and they weren't 30. I think Andy might have been 30 by the time he left, or just about to be. But really young team, and all of their profiles would have skyrocketed. And that would have helped them with their careers after football as well. They would be a lot more Evertonians in galleries, now on Match of the Day and Sky, etc. There just would be, because they would have achieved more, they would have done more, they'd have had more media columns, all of these things which helped towards, back then when they weren't, given £100,000 salaries per week, these guys missed out on so much. And who knows where they would have gone and what they would have achieved. So there were a lot of reasons for feeling sad about the fact that Everton were denied the opportunity. But it meant more. It probably had more impact. I think it had more impact on Everton players, fans, club's profile than any other club, because of where they were set to go. Heysel in 94, 95, Manchester United don't get their opportunity. The best players in Europe aren't going to come to a club that's not in Europe, because by then Europeans were coming to the Premier League, weren't they? So they don't get that opportunity, and it feels like that's one of the reasons why people level that we live in the past, etc., because it was an opportunity that very few have been denied. That team being so young, so good, and then just sort of cut off in their prime. That's why I think so many of us heave a heavy sigh when other people don't seem to understand or get why we're so annoyed.
Yeah, you're telling me. I was born in 98. I didn't even get to experience it, but I still share the same views. And that's a fantastic point, that if imagine if those players would have got that, was celebrated in that sort of celebrity status that the players get today. The social media era, almost, I suppose, it just provides us with so much more exposure. But just wanted to talk about the sort of editorial process of Howard's Way. Obviously, you had a strong background there. And I thought it was, and again, it's something that really set the film apart for me, was just how creative you were in that sort of pushing the film along, through the use of sports news programs, teletext. I know you use Sabutio for the buying game as well. It's so creative. So I'm just wondering how the editorial process was for you.
Well, it's your youth, isn't it? It's the things that I remember from that era. So, the day that Adrian Heath got clobbered by Brian Marwood, so our school was on a trip to London. And my only means of finding out how Everton were doing against Sheffield Wednesday that day was to find a TV that had teletext or CFAX. And I remember thinking, well, two birds with one stone here. I always wanted to go in Harrods, so I went marching into Harrods for no other reason than to find the TV section, and then just planted myself there and watched, found a TV that had the football scores coming up and the pages changing. And obviously it didn't tell me that Heath had got injured, but it did say that we were 1-0 down, and I stuck it out in the store until it was 1-1, and then I think we had to go or something. So that was my only way of finding out what the scores were. CFAX half the time, and we didn't have at home. We didn't have a CFAX telly. We didn't have a telly with teletext. So I remember we had some friends, and my mum would say, "Oh, we're going to go around to such and such's today," and I'd be chuffed to bits because I had no interest in talking to their friends, but I had a big interest in putting CFAX on and just surfing the sports pages. What was it, 302 on? Again, you're a youngster, but I'm pretty sure that football was 302. So the main sport was 301, football was 302, and that was your headlines. And I loved it. I loved CFAX. That was my youth. And there was a bit of radio that I used in there from Sport on 2 back in the 80s, that theme music that was such a part of my time. And it was all the things that I found interesting back then, and I could relate to, because I couldn't relate to how tough it was for people in Liverpool. The reason for straight away going to get someone like Dave Feely was that he went home and away for, from the 70s onwards, and his understanding of, being an Evertonian, and his story is extraordinary anyway, but just his knowledge of what it was like growing up in Liverpool at that time, particularly as an Everton fan who didn't have anything to cheer. You got the ones across the road. He gave me an analogy. I've always remembered it, and he said that effectively Everton were living in those sort of old Victorian buildings with 10 to a room, and no facilities, and that was their life. And then across the road there were the big Georgian mansions where Liverpool fans were, and in their swimming pools and smoking the big cigars, etc. And then he said, and one day we just went across the road and we kicked the door down to their big mansion, and we dived in their swimming pool, and we took their champagne and we smoked their cigars. And then he said, and then we got kicked out. But that analogy of how we suddenly came to life and took everything that was theirs for an all too short period of time. I really liked that. And he's a very clever guy, and I knew that he could give me what I needed in terms of authenticity. And then he said, you need to speak to Keith, because Keith and Dave Feely are big friends, but very big mates. And he said, Keith will help you with the music. And he did more than help, because, I had ideas in my head. I've read Dave Feely in particular, and other people say, I had no idea about the music. Well, there was some, like Rip It Up I'd already got, and an Embarrassment by Madness. But the ones that I really needed were the ones that meant a lot to the people of Liverpool. So the Lotus Eaters, and to know more about the bands. And we had the for a period of time. And This Is the Day, which is a great song, and I would never have got that, and I know we lost it in the end, but it was things like that, these little nuggets that Keith was giving me, and saying, don't worry about that, here's another one, and he was just this list of bands that were either big in Liverpool, came from Liverpool, or played a lot in Liverpool, like Fiction Factory, I think were a Scottish band, but we're often playing the Liverpool music scene. And so as soon as I would listen to 10 seconds of these songs, I thought it just transported me back to my era, that where I'd heard these songs 30 years ago, and maybe in some cases had not heard them since. And so suddenly the music was authentic. The fans' experience were authentic. There's so many things that ran that chat in the pub that we did. There's a few other stories that came about there. Keith got a fantastic story of getting into the Milk Cup final at Wembley, one without tickets and two in a stolen car that he didn't know was stolen. I mean, just brilliant stories that I can't relate to, because I come from Cornwall, and it wasn't like that for me. So I knew what was relevant to me in terms of the voices like Jim Rosenthal and Clive Tilsley, and I've worked with both of them and know them well enough to be able to approach them and say, look, I'd love you to be on this and bring something to it. And they were both brilliant. Clive brought along all the memorabilia that, I saw him load some up on Twitter yesterday. His
match notes are brilliant, aren't they?
Yeah, his match notes, his handwriting is lovely. I think you have to have really nice handwriting to be able to cram all the information in that Clive has done on those. But I could listen to Clive and Jim talk about that era and their stories all day. And the film wasn't the vehicle just for them, but there's so much stuff I've got of them, and I'll probably put something up, one of Jim's stories. But but they lived it. They were around these guys all the time, so they know this stuff. So why not make use of them? Because everyone knows who they are. And then you get the lovely bits where you can use Clive's commentary or Jim's pieces to camera. I spoke to Elton Wellesby, and Elton said he'd prefer not to do it, and so fair enough, because Elton was around them all of the time. So it was, to me, it was important to try and make it feel of its time, you know. So that if the music then drags you back, and yeah, I knew some of the tracks, but Keith did an unbelievable job on that, and then he composed the incidental music. There was another chap called Pete Davison who did some great stuff as well, but Keith did the majority of the non-commercial tracks and the stuff at the end, which I think there's two brilliant tracks there. I think one's called, if you look at it on Spotify or go to download, it's called Warm Heart, which is the tune that we picked for Howard's funeral, which obviously had to be the right tune, and Keith did an amazing job on that. So yeah, get the music, get little things like CFAX, Sabutio. Yeah, I played a lot of Sabutio when I was younger. And then Tom Regan, who's Toffee Art on Twitter. Either he or the guy that had bought them put up those amazing figures from the European Cup Winners' Cup team, and the detail on it, I just couldn't believe the detail. So I spoke to him, and he said, listen, have a chat with Edward, who commissioned these. Spoke to Edward, and Edward said, "Oh, I've built myself a little Goodison Park, but not just Goodison Park 2019. It's 1985. I've tried to recreate it as much as I can." So we went along to his place, and I'd got this idea. I would take them out of the packets and stuff. But then to see what he built, you know, it was brilliant. Well, it's one of my favourite shots in the whole film. Is the line where we pan along my cameraman Damien Bradshaw, who worked hugely long hours, and you know, they don't get any more pay. A cameraman doesn't get more pay just because he does 3 jobs in a day. He gets the same. So I worked him really hard, and he was incredibly understanding. But the shots that he got there that day, I loved them, and I had to be careful not to use too many to just sort of become self-indulgent. Oh, I love that one as well. You know, I had it in my head that once I saw the pitch, we can do some of the tackles here, and you know, I even did the ball boy, because he had a ball boy. Together, so I really like that, made me laugh. So included that, but those looked great, and so you get those little bonuses as you go along that you don't know that you're going to get when you start the whole thing. And John from Retrotext, he phoned me when we'd already started putting the film together, and I'd got my idea of how the graphics would look, and I'd do it fairly similar to I Believe in Miracles, just do the chart and then get the name going up or down the chart, the table. And John wrote to me and said, if you think I can help, I'd love to. And I thought his stuff was fabulous. So I got back to him and I said, could you do this? Could you do that? And he's like, yeah, nothing was too much trouble. So I would hugely recommend Retrotext. I've got his mugs here. I've got the mugs in the room. He sent me a couple of mugs, but you know, so Retrotext mugs, they're brilliant. Any game, any occasion. So he did those, and I suddenly took away all my anxiety with graphics, because I thought, okay, we now have a style, and we'll find some, you know, you just go on these sites to find tellies, old-fashioned tellies, put the text in those. So that helps. So you suddenly got Keith and Sabutio and the Retrotext CFAX looking stuff. But in terms of using old films, always loved that. When I was working on a film called Sevia, I was only the archive director on that one, archive producer, and I didn't really have a say in it. But I love using old titles, because I think, again, it throws you back to the era. So when you've got, you know, LWT, dum 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 dum, that thing going up, I loved that. That took me straight back to 70s, 80s, and I originally in the first cut had the big match tune from my era, you know. Dun, 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 dun. You won't remember that, but lots of people will. And I had that, but it was where I also had a bit of music, and I was going to dip out of the music to go to big match and then come back. And I got talked out of that. It's one of those where I probably wish I'd stuck to my guns. But all of those things are part of throwing you back to an era. And so I was very keen on using title sequences and Athay to deal with the stuff of old. Didn't go to town on Dixie, but certainly with Colin Harvey's, the fact that I saw that he'd scored the goal in '66, and that was beautifully done, and it allowed me then to introduce him. And I always wanted to use the '66 Cup final. And then when I got hold of Frank Wilmot, who was the windmill from the Anfield game, I thought, okay, so I can now use that how I want to. I use Eddie Cavana running on the pitch in '66 and getting tackled, and hope that people realise when I do it that I just haven't stuck it in the middle of the film, and that if you watch the next 5 or 6 minutes, it'll become apparent why he's there. So once I knew I got Frank, that allowed me to use '66 and Eddie Cavana, and keep the Colin Harvey stuff to introduce Colin at the start of the film. I love all the old stuff. I'm forever surfing it now to see if there's anything relevant to films that we may or may not be doing, and I just think they add character and a sort of richness, and also that bit of a surprise, the surprise element of, you think you've got used to the way that the rhythm of the film, and I like to sort of throw stuff in there, not to put people out of their comfort zone, but just to make people think, and that was a big part of it, plotting it. When you write down, I think I had in a book, I had about, each scene was a number, and I got to about 280 scenes, and, I would underscore, or I'd highlight pen where I got the opportunity to go back in time, whether it was with Pathé or with something from 20 years earlier, or whatever it might be. So even when Andy Gray's talking about when you wear the number 9 shirt, it gave me an opportunity to use Latchford and Dixie Dean. And originally they were both sort of 10-second chunks there, bit of Dixie Dean hanging on goalposts, which is from Pathé News, and Latchford scoring a goal. I had him scoring one where a diving header, and he runs away and did that double-fisted jump thing. And in the end, because I'm trying to cut down film and save on archive, those things went. But really important, I think, to keep throwing people back to an era. I think they work really well as a vessel for decorating the film with the 60s, 70s, 80s. I've never yet done anything where I throw it forward beyond the film, to go to another era. I mean, in theory, you could have, maybe if you were working at how do you get 95 in there or something like that. But maybe that's another film. But I love using title sequences and old footage to try and create a mood. Yeah,
brilliant. Because I know we talked about the Last Dance, and that's all the rave at the moment, about the Chicago Bulls in the 90s. And one of the sort of media criticisms I had, watching it through the sort of media student lens, it is quite jumpy between 94, then it's 97. It can be a bit discombobulating, but the way you sort of integrated that 66 final and all the sort of flashbacks, I thought it was done really well. And just finally, to sort of talk about the era and then move on to the interviews that you had with the players. As you say, being from Cornwall, you deserve huge credit for the sort of how you encapsulated that era in and around Liverpool at the time, because I found, obviously not experiencing the 80s, I did find it really politically informative, obviously with the inclusion of Derek Hatton in there as well. How did you find it? Was it like a learning process for yourself as well, finding out all these things? Because like my dad's told me about the riots and things like that, and all sorts of crazy stories. So how about yourself?
When I first put a treatment together, having gone to see Universal and come back from that, the first thing I did was work the Toxteth riots into it, because obviously 81 Howard arrived, Toxteth riots that summer. So that was something I wanted to get some information on fairly early on, so I knew that what I was looking for. Actually, the film wasn't. The finished version wasn't as political as perhaps it might have been at one stage. And I say political in the loosest sense. It probably had less footage of news footage of Derek and the riots and Thatcher, etc., than it might have had. But Two Tribes came out earlier in the year, and I thought it was a great film. I really enjoyed it. But I thought it did that, and I felt like, okay, I'm going to make this more Everton-centric now. Actually, the criticism that I've seen of the film online, it's been, the reviews have been largely wonderfully warm and positive. And I've seen a few people say too much Derek Hatton, and I understand that he was very divisive. Is now, was then. So I understand that. We even had somebody storm out of the. We did one in London. We did a show in London, premiere in London of the film, and somebody left very early on, fed up with too much Derek. But I just read up on that era. I wanted to read up on it and find out, what it was like. And I had always planned to include Derek. At one point, I'd included Michael Heseltine, because he was sort of unofficial Minister of Merseyside after Tock's death. And I wondered if I could maybe get Heseltine and Hatton together. And Derek said yes, and Michael Heseltine's office said they're not. So we didn't do that. But listen, I lived on a farm in Cornwall. And my dad was a very blue, and not Everton. And you have to understand why they're worried about their land. Farmers were worried about their land, and you have to sort of you understand what your family politics are and why. And I've never been overly political, really. But then I went away to college, and it was, let's say, it was very different to Cornwall, the politics there that I encountered there. And then you make your own mind up with the people that you see and what you understand is going on. And down south, I didn't really have a proper understanding of what it was like, now in Liverpool, but certainly then in the late 70s, 80s. And again, it was helpful to speak to people about that. And whether you agree with Derek's politics or not, I felt he was a very, very important part of that story, and the relationship that he had with the Tory government and the decisions that the Labour Council were preparing or looking to the decisions they were looking to take and the impact they were going to have on the people in the city. I wanted to know what that felt like, and I don't think we come down on one side or the other really in the film, but 90% youth unemployment for areas in Liverpool. People didn't have very much up here. People certainly weren't coming out. So Keith and David, when they left school, they weren't getting jobs. I spoke about earlier, when I left college, I had a choice. They didn't have a choice. And it was important to try and convey some of that, the mood. Again, I don't think I did too much of it, really, because I didn't feel qualified to do too much of it. I felt like, I didn't want to take myself out of my own comfort zone, even though I had the experience of David and Keith and Derek Hatton and anyone else. And a lot of the players felt what was going on. You're isolated to a certain extent, aren't you, when you play for a football club? And but Adrian said that he once got turned away. His car got turned away, and I think the players a lot of the time had sponsored stuff on the outside of their car, so people could see who it was driving. And he came across a roadblock somewhere, and they were saying, like, you need to turn around. So the players knew what was going on. They knew it was difficult. They appreciated the sacrifices that fans were making to get down there. I thought it was nice to use. I was disappointed when I watched Two Tribes, and they had some of the same footage that I'd planned to use from a film called Howard's Home and Away, and a film and some of the news footage that you've got, and you think, I wish they'd not already used it. But it meant that the politics in mine were played maybe a fractionally smaller part than they at one point were going to do. But there's no way you can tell a story about Everton and Liverpool in the 80s and not touch on what was going on for the people. And Derek Hatton was a big part of that.
Yeah, definitely. And as I say, you do deserve huge credit for the way you encapsulated it. I thought that line was brilliant. I think it's an interview at the time with a supporter saying, if you're a single lad from Liverpool and Everton get a trip down to Wembley, there's not much else going on. So, I'll make Goodison in Wembley, Goodison South, as it were.
Yeah, when a bloke's got nothing, football's got to do this. Yeah, so yeah, and it did, and Two Tribes very well told that story of how football really saved the city, because it gave hope to a city that really didn't have anything else. So yeah, I was keen to get it in there without going crazy on it, I think.
Definitely. Now, to the interviews with the players themselves, I mean, I'm full of gratitude to you for that opportunity to have the chance to speak to, you know, these heroes that I've been told stories from my granddad to my dad to my uncle who've told me all about, you know, just how fantastic that team was and how they were as individual players. Like I remember being like fairly confident. Obviously, I you know, from growing up, I know a lot. I've seen a lot. I've researched a lot. But then I remember walking through the doors at that lounge in Goodison and seeing Andy Gray and being like, "Oh my God, that's Andy Gray!" Like, honestly. But
You had the best talkers, the best three talkers. Well, three of the best talkers were in that room, weren't they? So Graham Sharp was there, Peter Reid, and Andy Gray. So you know, you're gonna do okay if you've got those in the room.
Yeah, I love speaking to them, and I was gonna ask you. You've got every right to be proud of every interview that you did because they were all fantastic interviews. But do any of them stand out amongst others?
Yeah, I'm sort of loath to I will anyway. They were all good. They were all good. I knew Andy would be brilliant. He gave me, I don't know, 5, 6. He was going back, I think, to Doha the following day, and he had other things booked, and he just kept cancelling them, and which was amazing. So I had 5 or 6 hours with Andy. He was fantastic, but I sort of knew he would be. And Peter Reid he's just a naturally funny bloke. So when you sit down with him, I had high expectations of that without knowing Peter that well. You come away from it and you just think that's brilliant. There's, you know, line after line after line from Peter Reid. So I knew they would be good, and they were good. Kevin Ratcliffe was excellent. I really appreciated his time. We had maybe had an hour with Kevin. We did Kevin Ratcliffe, Kevin Sheedy the same day. And Kevin Ratcliffe was very funny, very honest, you know, and you know, to come out with the stuff about, you know, Howard he didn't think Howard fancied him to start with, etc. They're all good interviews, but probably, and I say this, you know, Derek gave me so much time, and we went up into his loft, etc. They were all really, really good, but probably the guy that I didn't really know that well, and I now consider him to be a friend, is Graham Sharp, because Graham gave an enormous amount of time, did then, has since, and I said to him that, you know, he was quite early. I think that we'd maybe interviewed 3 or 4 players when I did Graham Sharp, and I thought, if everything collapsed now, after doing Graham, if everything collapsed and I didn't manage to get another interview, I had a film after Graham, because he did so well in sort of doing that chunk of pre-Howard coming in, and him again thinking, you know, maybe he doesn't fancy me here. He told me a great story about, you know, building up to the '84 Cup final when he wasn't really sure of his place, you know, and looked at the Cup final program, the one that was printed early, and he was down as a sub, I think. Graham, funny stories. I didn't know that, you know, he had funny stories. He laughed at himself, the tea towel, all sorts of stories that Graham told me. And that was the interview. Not that it surprised me, but just because I thought, that's great. I've got a film. I've really got a film. I'd interviewed Andy by that stage. And we'd done Colin Harvey. And so I knew there was some emotion around what the end of the film would be. But to get Graham, to get the amount of time I did with him, and yeah, that was a really good day. And you know, I think I was up there. I think that was the Monday, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of that week, we shot nearly all of the rest of the interviews, and they were all, there wasn't anybody that, I'll tell you, the only thing I came away disappointed, and it wasn't Paul's fault, it was my fault, is that I had got a picture, I'd printed a picture of Paul Bracewell's 85-86 haircut, which is like an army haircut, short, lots of gel, short, immaculate. I mean, and his wife was a hairdresser. And because Kev Richardson, we'd arranged for Kevin Richardson to come and meet us at Paul's house, because they don't live too far apart. So Kev was driving down and rings Paul Bracewell halfway through the interview. So we stop and we do the meet and greet and stuff. and it threw me off, and I missed a page which was all about Paul's haircut and his hairdressing and being a bit of a fashion icon and stuff. And we made it work in the film because, you know, Trevor was part of that, and I talked to other players about that, but I never talked to Paul about the haircut and his missus being a hairdresser and being, you know, loads of Everton fans copied Paul Bracewell's haircut.
Mm-hmm.
And I should mention that because it was funny, you know, and it would have been a nice line. And he was the one player, because I'd got an e-nika with me, and I hadn't done that bit, and that was the one time where I came away and thought, you know, because he's in Durham, you know, so it wasn't like I could pop up, and it was one of those where right until the end of the film, I was still playing with the idea of saying, Paul, can I come and do you again? But really, just to get a line about the haircut and show him the picture, you know, and I maybe lose some of the other things that he gave us. So, yeah, but they were all. There were no disappointing interviews. Everybody excelled with what they gave me. And I mentioned off air that you know, Kevin Sheedy was my favourite player, and having done the interview with him and thinking about all the other strong quotes that I got from loads of people, I didn't want my favourite player not to have a moment to himself in the film. So I rang him after that and said, I want to recreate the Ipswich free kick.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it was brilliant. And we got, you know, Karina Duffy at Everton in the community, who made things happen for me at Everton. She did a wonderful job there. I spoke to Karina and said, can we get on the pitch? I know it's late. And she organised that. So was able to get Kevin on the pitch. And even though he damaged his groin warming up, he still was able to do what we needed him to do, which was to put one in the top corner, one in the bottom corner. Yeah, so even Kevin, who probably with his interview alongside those like Reedy and Sharpie and Andy Gray, I might have lost some of it because I was able to do that 85 free kick. Then I thought, oh, excellent, box ticked. You know, I've got my favourite player in properly.
Yeah, brilliant. I was going to say, like, you did a really good job at sort of encapsulating what made individual players so great. Like, you give each individual player or standout player a few minutes to themselves, if you know what I mean, where they'd autograph their photograph, and you didn't stray too far from the narrative. I thought that was really, really smart. And as you say,
I'd always, in my head, I'd always got, you know that, I don't know if you've ever seen The Magnificent Seven. It's such a different era, Max, but if you watch the Magnificent Seven and The Dirty Dozen, it's basically films where somebody goes about getting their team together. And I thought I would like to, where possible, introduce everybody in it with a style, you know. So, you know, Peter Reid, that was the shot of him walking in. I knew he was going to be there that night. He knew we were coming to do that. But to have the opportunity to film him walking in with the sort of swagger and the music was perfect for Peter. And where possible, I wanted to introduce them and let them have a moment or two before rejoining the film.
Yeah, I'd love to have the chance to speak to the likes of Reedy and Andy Gray sort of over a podcast in a sort of prolonged fashion, because you say, like, Peter Reid, I don't think there's been a cooler man to kick a football, to be honest. He's fantastic, isn't he?
Yeah, do you know, the problem with Peter, it's not a problem. Well, it is a problem for me doing it, is that if you go and see him, you know, when he does any of the players' nights, etc., or an after dinner, he'll tell a million stories, but they will be littered with expletives, and that's just his natural way, and it works. You know, those evenings, you know, people are going to roar with laughter, and they do everywhere he goes, because he tells the stories brilliantly. He's a wonderful raconteur. So he told a lot of stories to me that day, but they lose something if he's having to stop himself to think, I better not swear.
Yeah.
And you know, there are a couple of stories that he told me that I still couldn't put in the film, but particularly that night when we had him and Graham and Andy and John Bailey all on the stage together, you know, we had a mic on Reedy. No good. He just, in that environment, he's going to tell the story the way he knows best, and quite rightly. But it just meant that I couldn't dip into any of those stories. But he is as funny a guy as you will ever meet. A funny guy that's trying to be funny, if you like, but we're telling funny stories. Whereas John Bailey, the players will say he doesn't always know that he's being funny, but has a lovely way about him. But Peter is just, he's almost unique. He's very, very funny, and it was a joy to have the time that we did with him. And any of the times that I've asked him to do a Twitter Q&A and come on, it's just great fun. Mm-hmm. Because he has the Scouse humour. He just gets it. I'm looking at his Twitter feed. Even today, he's put somebody away with a very funny comment. And that's just him. He's just a very funny guy. Very funny guy.
Yeah, I'm gonna say with John Bailey, that little bit with him and Pat Van Den Aar was absolutely brilliant. Like, they seem like a naturally funny guy.
So John Bailey and Pat were supposed to turn up together when we did Pat. That was one of the things I wanted to do, that bit together. I wanted to have sort of Pat interrupt John's interview. That was one of those things that you got planned. So the day that Pat and John were supposed to meet up, John went to the wrong venue, and he doesn't carry a mobile phone, so I couldn't get hold of him. So he's wandering around Goodison Park, and I run up there later, and I'm like, "Have you seen John Bailey?" Yeah, he was here earlier, and I can't get hold of him. So we had to do Pat on his own, and then bless him, Pat was good enough that when we finally got John Bailey, Pat said, "Yeah, no, I'll come down." And despite the fact that when we interviewed Pat to start with, I think he was reluctant, and had to be sort of coerced into doing it. But I thought he was excellent, Pat. I loved him doing it and throwing himself into it in the way he did, because he didn't hold back. He didn't give me sort of one-word answers or anything, which he might have done. We've met him before, and so it was okay. And I felt like he trusted me that we would, and Dave Feely was there, who he knew, and I felt like he trusted us that we wouldn't stitch him up or anything. And I think he was wary of that. But then he came down for when John was doing his stuff at Goodison, and so Pat turned up and bought into it. And I loved it. That was another really, really good day. That was the same day we filmed Kevin Sheedy's free kick. So there are so many memories that I'll take away from the filming, the experience that we had, and that was one wonderful day, and there were loads of them. I just feel now, I'm talking to you now, and I'm thinking about the fun that we had, and here we are a year and a bit on, and we're just stuck in. And thank goodness I was able to do it last year and have that time with them, because it was just, I'll never do anything where I have as much fun as that. Never, ever, ever.
Brilliant. I was going to say, like, you couldn't have picked a better time, especially with obviously following the pandemic and the sort of forced absence of football, which I'm sure is like the first time in most people's lifetime that they've ever experienced that, other than those that have lived through a war. Like, obviously no one wants to miss out on the football, and everyone's missing it sorely, but I'm sure, like, because I've seen like the official Everton channel have been embracing the film, and the film seems to be going strong as ever.
Well, the important thing is that the message has sort of changed. So Everton have got on board, because basically we are now giving the proceeds from the film to Everton in the Community's People's Place project, the mental health facility. So all the money raised from the film is going to that, and Everton have jumped on and have been brilliant, and I think there's lots more content to come. But Carlo was involved last week, wasn't he, talking about the film, and I think maybe there's a bit more Carlo to come, and Andre Gomez put out the tweet that he was watching it, and Wayne Rooney, and these are all players that the club have helped to get hold of, and hopefully we'll keep going, and because there's a big target there, isn't there? To be able to build the People's Place is a lot of money, and there are two investors in the film. And what Phil Brown, who is the other half, so my wife and I put up the money, because at one point it didn't look like the film was going to get made, so we had a decision, either put it up or don't make it. So we did, and Phil, who was the other half of the investment, he basically is underwriting the production costs. So for every pound that he gets from the film proceeds, he's then matching that. So in that way, we can say 100% of the proceeds going to people's place, which is a brilliant gesture by Phil. So the club have now they were supporting us anyway, but now it's different, because there's an objective here, and hopefully we can keep going, and people keep downloading it and buying the DVD, because the DVD's got the extras, and obviously that's the only place you can see all the extras. And see if we can't get that mental health facility built.
Yeah, it's great that the initiatives have been married almost, and it is it feels very Everton-like to have that.
Very Everton, isn't it? I totally get what you mean by that. It feels no club is closer to its community, to its fans, to the heartbeat. I don't feel, and maybe that changes when we go to Bramley-Moore Dock, and and the more investment that comes in, maybe we lose a little bit of that. But right now, Goodison Park, the people that are involved at this club, top of the club, even someone like Richarlison, who shouldn't really have any reason to get it, and maybe he's not here in 3 years' time or whatever, but he feels, Gomez, Richarlison, they feel like they get it, some of these guys, and it is a really special club. And if I could go back 45 years and be in the playground with all the people that were telling me that I should support Liverpool or Forest or whatever, I wouldn't change anything, because I just think it's an incredibly special club, and it's a huge thrill. I don't really think of it now. Maybe in 10 years' time, that I will. That the film is a part of the history of the club, or will be. And that's that'll mean an awful lot to me. That people like it, and that now finally it's represented on film. That great team is represented on film. If there was a sort of mission statement before we started, that would be it, that people get to see that team and learn a little bit more about that team, the club, the people. It's a very special club. I love it. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, and I've seen this bandied about on Twitter a few times, but honestly, like as you were saying, may change as investment continues. But if ever that feeling is starting to escape from the club or the players or what have you, I've seen the suggestions, sit them down and get them to watch this film. So 100% would agree it will go down as part of the history of the club. I was going to ask you who your favourite player was, and you made that clear. It's Kevin Sheedy.
That era, he was my favourite player. Bob Blatchford is the only Everton sort of hero I've got, but Sheeds, yeah, that team, brilliant.
I was going to say, have you got a particular moment from that era that means most to you?
The 84, well, that whole film, probably Heath's winner against Southampton, because again, as a kid, my only relationship with Everton was Match of the Day, papers, my parents' friends, CFAX, 5 to 10 on a weekday, 5 to 10 you used to get on BBC Radio 2, you'd get a sports bulletin. That was the only way you could find out the football scores. So in that era, the FA Cup final was everything. They'd come on air at 11 o'clock. The night before, it was about the FA Cup finals. So as a school kid, going to school in those days, to have the FA Cup final focus on your team was amazing. And it was such a special day that everybody watched the FA Cup final in those days. Even if you were a neutral, you still watched it. You still cared greatly. You still watched all of the build-up and everything that went with it, because there wasn't so much football on TV those days. So that was the moment, having had the heartbreak. And I remember 77 being, because I wasn't allowed to stay up. So in 77, I was 7 when we lost in the cup semi-final to Liverpool 3-2. So I watched Match of the Day, but only because I was allowed to get up, having had 3 or 4 hours of sleep between sort of 3 and 7 or something like that. Or no, it wouldn't have been 3, but a little bit later in the day, I had to go to bed to get up to watch Match of the Day. So I remember watching Match of the Day and feeling the disappointment when that goal was ruled out, and always having, what are we now? So 43 years on, Clive Thomas's name doesn't mean disallowed goal for Brazil against Sweden. It means disallowed goal for Everton against Liverpool that day. And, his name and Brian Hamilton's name, these things matter because it denied the cup final opportunity, the day of coverage. And then, in 80, went through it again when Frank Lampard's dad, is Frank Lampard Senior's header, sort of bounces at an odd angle and goes in, and West Ham beat us. I think they were second division. I think they were a league below us at the time, and Latchford had just scored an incredible equaliser. I'm listening to it on the radio. We weren't live. Listening to it on the radio, and the noise when Latchford scored, and then crying my eyes out when Lampard scored so close to the end, and again being denied that opportunity to see my team have that day, that FA Cup final day. And to have the Milk Cup final, there's no real build up to the Milk Cup final. I remember it being live. I think it was a Sunday, wasn't it? But I remember it being live and watching it, etc. But it wasn't the event. Brilliant to be in the Milk Cup final, and it celebrated like crazy when we got there. But living a sort of living Everton through the TV to get to the FA Cup final was everything to have that day. And then when Heath scored, and knowing that it was so close to the end, and just the noise coming out through the radio, when the radio distorts when the noise is too great, and just the noise, and knowing that you picking out a few words from the commentator that Heath had scored, and realising that what that meant, and my first reaction, because Everton meant heartbreak at that time, was that, well, at least we won't lose now. We're guaranteed another go at this. And then, it's over and you're in an FA Cup final. And from that moment onwards, whatever it was, mid-April, April 14, whatever, until May the 19th, I'm going to school every day thinking about the FA Cup final and what it's going to mean, and being on telly and ordering the Cup final programme, as we did, got the Cup final. You could order it in those days, so we got the Cup final programme through the post. And I remember I used to get a comic called Tiger and Scorcher, and they had a big build up to that, and Match magazine and stuff like that. It was all dedicated, and that meant that from the moment that Heath had scored and we'd won that game, the whole of my life could be dedicated. I wasn't O-levels that year. It was the year before O-levels, I think, for me. So it could be a whole of my life could be dedicated to waiting and going through an FA Cup day and living it, and also feeling that Everton were maybe back, because they weren't going to be playing Liverpool in that final. They were going to be playing Watford, and with due respect to them, I just thought we were going to win. I just felt we were starting to go that way instead of doing that or that. I just felt that there was something happening, and that day, cameras on in the hotel, cameras on the coaches. I lived that and loved it, and then to win the game. So Adrian Heath's goal and what it meant, the excitement that it gave me was unmatched. And even though the joy of winning the league the following season and all the other things, nothing that first time that Everton were on grandstand and World of Sport for the whole day, furiously flicking over. I think actually in those days I had to get up to push the telly over, so change it from, I'm sure of it, didn't have a remote. To change the channel from BBC One to ITV, you had to physically get off your backside and do it at the TV. But just doing it all the time, just to make sure I didn't miss anything, and get the goal when Sharp scored, get the goal and a replay, rush over to ITV. Are they still talking about the goal? Watch both of them, flick again at half time. I'm doing this with my fingers,
Yeah.
Flick from one channel to the other. Just didn't want to miss anything. Watch Match of the Day in the evening. Ugh. It was that month between the semi-final and the final was probably the happiest. I don't remember anything I was doing at school at that particular point, but I know that was just. I had a little flat cap. Had those, remember the blue and white
ones, yeah.
And I had an Everton coat. I guess my mum must have ordered it from Everton. I don't know where you would get it from, but I had an Everton, an outdoor coat. Like my jacket was an Everton one, and I just went to school with such pride every day for 2 years, pretty much from that point onwards. It was, so Heath's goal at Highbury that day, and I know it's special for all of those guys that were in the ground and ran onto the pitch and all the rest of it. But for me in my little home in the kitchen at Cornwall and just running off into the garden, and that's my favourite Everton memory, and nothing will ever touch it.
Excellent. And I know quite a few of the ex-players, talking to them, they really speak highly of that FA Cup and the sort of the spectacle that it was. And I'd even say going on to 2009, I think I was just still in primary school. I remember, we beat Manchester United, and we were playing Chelsea in the final, albeit heartbreak by Frank Lampard Jr. and Didier Drogba. But it meant a lot. And God, I want to see us win something.
Do you know though? I was working in '95. I was working for Sky, and and you're supposed to be. I was working with Nick Collins. I see the Everton coach coming, and I thought, I can't not do this. So I said, do you mind if I run off? And he said, yeah, where are you going? I said, oh, the Everton coach is coming. And he said, you coming back? And I said, yeah, of course I'm coming back. But anyway, so I sprinted off. The Everton coach came in, and just to a man, they were all shouting, Duncan Ferguson, Duncan. So I remember shouting that at the coach, and then running back to, and that it just took my mind back to 84 and the scenes of the coach coming in 84. And I just don't think you'll ever match that. No club will go through that. Jimmy Martin, who's a kit man now and the bus driver then, says that no bus driver will experience what he did that day. Just that desperation, and that, but with a sort of thank you as well. It was like we've waited so long, and now we're back, and you're giving us something to be proud of. And the fans, and I don't think the fans are any different. When I go into the Winslow after a game or something, or I, you see me when you guys are recording your bits and bobs at the end of the games, and you still feel it, and the people coming out. If Everton won a trophy again, it would be absolutely mental. It'd be mental, and I don't care what any other club says. Everton supporters are different, and you can't give what they give. If you're winning, maybe if you're winning stuff all the time, you do sort of become a bit nonchalant about it. But Everton supporters are different. They feel it in a different way. The club is different. If they win, if we win anything again in the next, it would just be, especially if we win it while we're still at Goodison, and so they could have the parade around. Just to be able to do that would be, and the old ground deserves it, doesn't it? Deserves one more, don't
more
you think?
parade.
So, yeah, it's an amazing club, and we've had so many, not great moments. But I don't care about any other club. Honestly, I don't care. You win everything you want to. If Everton, I want Everton to get back to the top, because your standards are your standards, and mine were formed in the 80s.
Yeah.
But I don't care about the rest. Just let Everton have something now. If we can get something, it'd be utterly amazing. Oh God, it'd be amazing.
I know. Nil satis nisi optimum, right? I mean,
exactly that.
I long for that day when we finally get a bit of silverware. Honestly, I'd be up there. So I'd go missing for a few days. I've got to say, honestly, Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, and you're more than welcome to come on the podcast whenever you want to talk about films, football, media, whatever.
Loved it, Max. Thanks, mate.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time.